Hey everyone, this is James here. Today I am going to be talking about Enzo G Castellari and going to be talking about some of the deeper cuts, some of the more underrated films in his filmography. So sort of similar to what I did for Damiano Damiani. So just a real quick summary of Castellari really is he's most well known perhaps for Inglourious Basterds thanks to Tarantino's film of the same name. But that film really is kind of like the Amityville 2 is to Damiani as Inglourious Basterds is to Castellari of his films. It doesn't really stand for everything that he did. Nevertheless, it does show some of the good things of him, his action prowess especially. But he's a director that definitely worked most heavily in westerns and poliziotteschi. I think he did 7 westerns and 5 poliziotteschi. He did just a couple macaroni combat films like Inglourious Basterds. That's one of those films that I initially didn't like, but I've sort of come around on. I do like it a fair bit, or at least I see the appeal pretty clearly in that film these days compared to what I originally did. Nonetheless, we won't be talking about that because that is perhaps the most well-seen of the Castellari films. So Arrow released a box set just a couple of years ago on The Big Racket as well as Heroin Busters, and I was really happy to see that box set, not just because I think both films are really good and well worth watching, but just because it does shine a little bit of love on that poliziotteschi genre, which I'm such a big fan of, that in my opinion is just underrated in general. And I think, in my opinion, the Castellari work in that genre is his best work, period. So going to be talking today about films with under 1,000 views on Letterboxd. In my opinion, too, same with Damiani, his most well-known films aren't necessarily the best. One example of maybe like kind of the tier of films that are next most well-known besides Inglourious Basterds are his post-apocalyptic output. So things like New Barbarians, Bronx Warriors, and the sequel to the Bronx Warriors, I forget what that one's called. I'm just not a huge fan of those. I think they're okay for what they are. The post-apocalyptic Italian subgenre based off of kind of like Escape from New York is not necessarily my favorite to begin with. Even those films do have their moments, but for me at least, they're not especially stand out in his overall filmography. Castellari is also one of those directors where even in his lesser films that just don't work quite as well, they can still have some really, really great moments. And part of that is because he is so good at filming action and he is very creative. So you can tell even when maybe he's going through the motions a little bit in terms of the narrative and whatnot, sometimes things just click into place and you have these like wonderful, what I described in a previous episode as sort of like these Castellari moments where you have like really wonderfully choreographed things of slow motion. So I'm thinking of Jonathan of the Bears, which I just saw earlier this week, where we have this great scene where the Native Americans basically ambush the John Saxon's settler gang who is trying to basically ambush the Native Americans in the first place. So, and we just have like incredibly slow motion shots. I also imagine something like D'Angelo's score, Brothers score kicking in. That doesn't happen in Jonathan of the Bears, but you kind of get the point that he has these really strong images, and I think, in my opinion, he's the best of the Italian directors at just photographing action. So Castellari, sort of like a lot of the directors from the Italian film industry, did fall off from kind of the peak of the Italian industry, sort of like Sergio Martino. But in my opinion, some of the later Castellari films are a little bit more well worth watching than perhaps later Martino films. Okay, so let's get into the movies. So again, films with under 1,000 views on Letterboxd. First up, I have Castellari meets Shakespeare. I've talked about this film a couple times. This film is almost exactly what it seems like. It's a really solid story, and then he is very, very good with the action. I think this one works well because of the contrasting strengths. I think Shakespeare helps to fill in a lot of the holes in sort of Castellari's his narrative telling. He can tell a story fairly well, but I think having a very solid story, one that has literally stood the test of times, like Hamlet, works really well for Castellari, who can like basically stylize everything and give everything a little bit of a fresh feel. And so that's exactly what Johnny Hamlet is. In my opinion, this is top 4 or 5 Castellari and very, very much underrated. So this is probably my top pick of them. Next up, I have Day of the Cobra, which is a little bit of a lesser poliziotteschi Eurocrime film from him. It's lighter on its feet. It's chiller. It's a fun watch. You have Nero and Castellari again. That's a combination that almost always works pretty well. Next up, we have a one that was recommended by Third Pill blog. So thank you again for that recommendation. Eagles Over London. This is his other kind of like wartime film. This one's set in England mostly. It's a pretty good spy thriller. There's decent action throughout, and it's well made and put together. And you can definitely feel like the budget for this, as well as Inglourious Bastards, is pretty good. You even get a Dunkirk scene. I don't think this film is a masterpiece or anything like that, but it's a lot better than you would think, given its virtually unknown status. I think a very, very solid film. I forget exactly when this one came out. It must have been early 70s or late 60s. But a good film, and definitely one, if you're a fan of Castellari, that I would strongly recommend you check out. It doesn't necessarily feel as much like a Castellari film as Johnny Hamlet or Day of the Cobra, but it is, you do when it does kick into sort of this action, we get explosions and things like that. I think it is pretty good. Next up, I have one I watched a few years ago, and that is The Shark Hunter. This is my favorite one of the Castellari shark films. This one has a DeAngelis Brothers score set in the Caribbean. You have Franco Nero there. And I don't know, sort of like Day of the Cobra, this is just a good time hanging out with my friends Franco Nero and Enzo Castellari. Get some style. It's a fun setting. And it's just, it's a fun time to watch. Yeah. Next up, I have a couple films that are definitely geared a little bit more towards they feel a little bit more Americana. I have Hammerhead and Light Blast with Daniel Green in Hammerhead. These both are a little bit more like 80s macho action. They both have good action. Of course, we're working with kind of much smaller budgets than kind of the American counterparts in here. But I think these films still show his strength in terms of composing action. You have some good slow motion. Very, very 80s. I would take these over his post-apocalyptic films. Maybe that's just my personal preference, but I think they're both pretty good. I think Hammerhead is probably the one that I would pick over Light Blast. Light Blast has a little bit more of a sci-fi feel to them, but they're both fun and good movies as long as you don't set your expectations too high. They both also feel like Castellari films. In terms of his earlier westerns, there's a lot that you could pick from. A lot of them are pretty good. Probably the most famous one has too many views on Letterboxd. That's Kill Them All and Come Back Alone. But $1 Too Many is the one I picked. This one has his westerns, his earlier westerns, definitely are pretty influenced by Leone in terms of taking multiple leads and just kind of casting their dynamics off of each other, where people are betraying people. There are different alliances being formed. This one has Frank Wolf, Antonio Sabato, and John Saxon. All three are pretty good there. I think Frank Wolf and Saxon are probably the two more beloved actors, but I think Sabato is quite good here. He brings a pretty different energy than the other two Americans, so I think it works pretty well here. I watched this one very recently too. So those were my 5 different recommendations here. Here are some of the other films that I watched, and I'll just say a little bit of my thoughts, and you can decide whether they're worth watching or not. I watched Payment in Blood and Any Gun Can Play. These are also early Castellari westerns. I think they're both pretty good as far as these things go. I just prefer $1 Too Many by a little bit. Any Gun Can Play has also that sort of 3-lead structure to them, and they both have pretty good, solid action, and definitely well worth watching if kind of like these deeper cut spaghetti westerns are your thing. I was not a fan of House by the Edge of the Lake. This one felt very different. I'm also not a huge fan of Cold Eyes of Fear, sort of the Castellari jolly-ish film. I just don't think he's particularly well suited towards horror. I find it really weird and kind of funny that he was offered Fulci Zombie. That one certainly worked out for the better, I think, for everyone, just because Zombie is a really great film, and I don't know that Castellari had it in him to make that sort of film. And next up I have that I did see was Striker. This one fits right alongside Hammerhead and Light Blast in terms of like fun, stupid, Americana, macho fun. I think it's a little bit worse. The lead in there, I forget what his name was, is just not quite as good as the other ones. I think it's, just a half tier or a tier below those other movies. So if you like the other ones, maybe give Striker a shot. And last up I have Jonathan of the Bears. This one took way too long to get going. It's almost 2 hours long. Nonetheless, when it does get going, it definitely has some fun moments. You have John Saxon and Franco Nero. I think John Saxon is particularly good here in the villainous role. So I think it does have that going for it. And some of the choreography once the action does kick in. This one's very, very clearly influenced by Kyoma. Kyoma is a much better film, but this one does have, a surprisingly big seeming budget behind it. Filmed in the 90s. I think this one was filmed in Russia, but set in kind of like the American Western setting. The soundtrack for me was fairly forgettable. Probably the last kind of big budget that Castellari was able to work with. So if you really do want a deeper cut, it's not bad. I think it just doesn't quite live up to some of the more fun Castellari ones. I think if you had shortened this down to 90 minutes, maybe it would be a bit better. It feels a little bit like Castellari was a little rusty, and getting ramped up and getting going took a little bit more time in something like this film. Okay, so that wraps up this episode. Thank you all for tuning in. Let me know how you liked it. Let me know if you've seen some of these deeper cuts, and I will see you all next time.